The 1960s and 70s are often associated with social and political upheaval and, in general, an anti-establishment atmosphere. These conditions provide the context for the rise of institutional critique as a movement, instigated by artists who are driven to oppose, subvert, or break out of rigid institutional frameworks. The rise of institutional critique is often linked to the development of conceptual art. Conceptualists believed that the artist's job was to expose art's dependence on the framework in which it is presented. Artists such as Hans Haacke, Daniel Buren, and Michael Asher went beyond conventional artistic practices, fusing art criticism with practice. They examined the ideological and economical influence of the museum and devised projects to reveal that the museum's architectural structures are not as disinterested and neutral as they would like to appear. Haacke in particular focused on museum funding, targeting the people in positions of power within the institutional structure. He described his work as real-time social systems operating in an art context, conducting polls and presenting documentation about the business dealings of the wealthy. His 1970 work, MoMA Poll, consisted of 2 transparent boxes, a photoelectric counting device, and a set of ballot papers, installed at the Museum of Modern Art's group show Information. Visitors were asked to respond to the question, would the fact that Governor Rockefeller has not denounced President Nixon's Indochina policy be a reason for you not to vote for him in November? The question refers to Nelson Rockefeller, a 4-term Republican governor of the state of New York, who was running for re-election in 1970. The Rockefeller family was instrumental in the founding of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, and Nelson Rockefeller was a member of the museum's board of trustees from 1932 until his death in 1979. There were visibly twice as many yes ballots as no's. According to Haacke, I had not revealed the content of my question until the night before the opening. David Rockefeller was not amused. Word had it that an emissary of his arrived at the museum the next day to demand the removal of the poll. However, John Hightower, who had just been appointed director of the museum, did not follow orders. He lasted in his job less than 2 years. Had the question been revealed prior to the exhibition opening, do you think it would have been censored? What about if the exhibition was taking place in modern times? How do you think the museum would have handled it? What do you think has changed about the museum institution since 1970? Much of Haacke's work was censored by various museums. For example, his Manet Project 74, which was rejected by the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. The work was related to the museum's recent acquisition of Edouard Manet's Bunch of Asparagus, and detailed the provenance of the painting and Nazi background of the patron, Hermann Joseph Abs, who had given the painting to the museum as a permanent loan. Haacke was also censored by the Guggenheim Museum in New York. His work, Schapolsky et al. Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, a real-time social system as of May 1, 1971, exposed the real estate portfolio of a New York slumlord. At the peak of his career, real estate investor Harry J. Schapolsky owned as many as 200 tenements in Harlem and the Lower East Side, 2 neighborhoods characterized by their ethnic and racial minorities. Using public records, Haacke revealed the transactions of the real estate firm between 1951 and 1971. The work includes maps, diagrams, and 142 photographs of buildings, accompanied by typed text that describes the location and the financial transactions, such as the date of acquisition, cost of the mortgage, and the assessed land value. What do you think the significance of this work was? What point do you think Hans Haacke was trying to make here? And why do you think it might have been so controversial that it was then had to be censored by the gallery? This work draws attention to how housing in impoverished neighbourhoods was lucratively run at a low level of maintenance, reducing the social needs of city residents to a mere economic product. Harry Sapolsky had attracted Hahn's attention because he was the landlord who owned more slum properties than any other landowner in New York. The work was due to be displayed at Haacke's one-artist show at the Guggenheim. However, the Guggenheim's director, Thomas Messer, called Sapolsky et al. Inadequate and refused it along with two other works. Edward Fry, curator of the exhibition, defended the works and was subsequently fired. The show was cancelled 6 weeks before it was due to open. Many commentators have speculated that the Board of Trustees of the Guggenheim Museum were connected to the real estate group. The cancellation inspired Haacke to create a work outlining the corporate affiliations of the Guggenheim board members. In 1974, Hans Haacke mounted an index of the museum's corporate sponsors and board of trustees along the Guggenheim's walls. The work revealed the political and economic relationships of the people running the museum. Like Haacke, Daniel Buren was also censored by the Guggenheim. While Haacke focused on the economic structures of the museum, Buren used the architecture of the museum to explore how institutions frame works of art. According to the artist, any object placed on exhibition in a museum space is framed not only physically by the museum architecture, but also by the cultural context in which a museum signifies. In 1971, Buren created Paint Your Sculpture, a 32-foot wide, 66-foot long striped banner hung from the skylight dividing the Guggenheim's rotunda in two and obscuring views of other artworks and the architecture. It specifically addressed the museum's imposing architecture and transformed the way in which the space functioned. Buren's intention was to undermine the assumption that museums offered neutral viewing conditions. His goal was to expose museums as ideological constructs. However, several other artists in the exhibition complained that the sculpture blocked views of their work. Consequently, the Guggenheim decided to remove Buren's work the day before the opening. Later, for his 1973 solo show, Buren suspended a set of 19 black and white striped squares of canvas on a cable that ran from one end of the John Weber Gallery to the other, out the window, all the way to the building on the other side of the West Broadway street. Why do you think Buren did this? What would it have been like to see the work, first of all, within the gallery space, and then second of all, outside on the street? The banners themselves are identical. However, they appear completely different when viewed inside a gallery to outside in the urban frame of New York City. Buren establishes this contrast, drawing attention to the influence of context on how a work is viewed, accepted, and understood. Throughout his career, Buren has been concerned with the context within which art is displayed, and has used his work to draw attention to the often unnoticed formal, political, economic, and ideological characteristics of a specific site. Buren examines a site's structure, architecture, the layout of rooms, exits, hallways, staircases, windows. He also considers the more abstract aspects of a given space, the network of social, economic, and political forces at play in any given context. Like Buren, Michael Asher also focused on the architecture of museums in order to highlight and undermine their claims to be neutral aesthetic spaces. For example, at the Claire Copley Gallery, Los Angeles in 1974, Asher temporarily removed the partition wall that separated the office from the exhibition space, revealing the otherwise hidden gallerist working at her desk. Why might Asher have done this? By removing the wall, Asher unmasked the normally unseen administrative underpinnings of the gallery. Visitors to the gallery encountered a space whose only apparent focus was the administration of business. So this work addresses issues of labour and economic exchange, but also invited the gallery visitors to re-examine their understanding of how visual art functions within the larger social domain. In 1979, Asher moved a life-size bronze statue of George Washington from its prominent position at the main entrance of the Art Institute of Chicago and moved it inside the museum. The statue was installed in Gallery 219, a room devoted to European painting and sculpture from the late 18th century, the same period as the statue. By removing the statue from its pedestal and moving it inside, Asher removed its monumentality and transformed it into merely a weathered period sculpture. Once again showing how the context of a work can really determine how it's perceived and its perceived value. In order to critique the institution of the museum, some artists created faux museum exhibitions. One of the most influential was Marcel Broodthaers' Museum of Modern Art, Department of Eagles, a conceptual museum with no permanent location and no permanent collection. Broodthaers was inspired to create the museum following the occupation of the Palais des Beaux-Arts by artists in Brussels in May 1968, in which Broodthaers, as one of the occupation's leaders, condemned the commercialization of art. He founded the museum in the same year in his apartment in Brussels, mounting postcards of 19th century artworks using imagery of eagles on his walls. He painted signage saying museum on his windows, labelled individual rooms as numbered galleries, and included descriptions for the artworks. Over the following 4 years, Broodthaers added another 11 sections, which were shown in different locations and for various lengths of time. Among the departments were the documentary section, which existed for a single day and consisted of a sculpture of a museum carved out of sand on a beach. His 19th century section featured an empty fine art crates bearing stenciled instructions such as keep dry and handle with care, which were displayed alongside postcard reproductions of famous 19th century French paintings. As one art historian explains, in 1968, when Broodthaers inaugurated his Museum of Modern Art, the debate revolved around the idea of a radical liberation from cultural institutions. Broodthaers' Museum of Modern Art engages with a multitude of issues surrounding art institutions, such as power and money. He questions the formality of the museum with the impromptu nature of his construction of the institution, its ability to be dismounted and reassembled, the absence of any permanent collection, the wholesale display of mechanical reproductions of traditional artwork, which also critiqued the very nature of what constitutes art. His choice of the eagle for the museum's symbol allowed him to re-examine its multitude of meanings, power and strength when employed by government agencies, but also solitude and independence when compared to other birds. In 1970, emphasizing the economic functioning of cultural institutions, Broodthaers created the financial section, declaring the museum for sale on account of bankruptcy. The sale was announced on the cover of Cologne Art Fair catalogue in 1971, but failed to attract a buyer. Broodthaers also produced a 1 kilo gold ingot stamped with an eagle to raise funds for the museum. The price was set at double the market value of gold. Why do you think Broodthaers decided to set the price at double the market value of gold? The increased value of the gold ingot represented the artistic value of the object, transforming it effectively from a commodity into an art object. As museum director, Broodthaers also authorized the artwork with a letter of authenticity issued to the buyer. Through the purchase of the Broodthaers ingot, the buyer would help seal the deal that it was actually a valid work of art and not just gold. As Duchamp had indicated before with his ready-mades, art has no specific essence or quality other than it being chosen or nominated by an artist and then also accepted as art by the artistic establishment, which includes the art market. According to the artist, whether it's a urinal signed by Armat or a found object, any object can be elevated to a piece of art. The artist defined the object in such a way that only the museum can be its future.